Warning: the following podcast might be too truthful for most liberals. Listener discretion is therefore advised.
Welcome to the Tea Party Power Hour. This is your host, Mark Galar, and what a special show we have today. We have Amber Smith, the author of Unfit to Fight. It's a great book. I've already finished it, and you're going to want to read it too. Amber actually flew helicopters in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And she was then the deputy assistant to the Secretary of Defense. She's done numerous television interviews, including Fox News, Newsmax, hopefully soon Tea Party Power Hour. And I can tell you she's written for The Daily Caller, The Blaze, The Federalist, townhall.com, and Aviation Weekly. Obviously a flaming liberal. Amber, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Sure. Well, first let's talk a little bit about you. You were a helicopter pilot in Iraq. That's not something that we see with a whole lot of people. In fact, I think you said in the book that less than 1% of Americans have been in active service. So tell us a little bit about you. What made you want to join the military? What made you want to fly helicopters?
So I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq was 05-06. Afghanistan was basically all of 08. And I served in the 101st Airborne Division, Band of Brothers, Screaming Eagles. And for my entire service, aside from my training down at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And I was lucky enough to fly the OH-58 Delta Kiowa Warrior helicopter. It's a light attack reconnaissance helicopter. We carry a 50 cal machine gun, a rocket pod that carries 7 high explosive rockets, and then we can also be configured to carry Hellfire missiles. Mm-hmm. And what's very unique about our aircraft is our mission. We fly direct support for ground forces, so we only have 2 pilots in the aircraft. It's not a passenger aircraft, it's a reconnaissance aircraft. So we don't carry anyone other than the 2 pilots. And we do reconnaissance, we hunt for IEDs, we do convoy securities, we observe artillery fire. But probably the biggest mission is responding to troops in context and provide close air support. So finding, fixing, and destroying enemy targets.
I think you said in the book that at one point a bullet came within 6 inches of hitting you. Is that correct?
I did, yes. Our aircraft got shot up in Iraq, and I had a bullet land in the armor control unit, which is just a little bit behind your seat.
I can't imagine what that must have been like. Did you know right away, or did you discover it after you landed?
We didn't know the extent of the damage exactly until we landed, but yeah, we knew we'd been hit with something likely. We didn't know what it was. We did feel a concussion blast, so we were pretty low level. It was at night, and we saw the flash, and all of our electronics in the aircraft went dark. So we knew we had been hit with something. We just didn't know to the extent. We didn't know if the flight controls, were going to give out on our way back to the FARP, which is where you get gas, a friendly location. So it was a nerve-wracking, 10-minute flight back when we didn't know what was going on.
You mentioned in the book that we could be headed toward a draft. Now, you enlisted, obviously voluntarily. We're not using the draft anymore. But what makes you think that we're heading toward the possibility of a draft, not just for men, but maybe even for women?
Yeah, so the trend of our recruiting numbers is drastically fallen. It's downward, and it has been for years. And the biggest issue that I have with, throughout the last few decades since the Vietnam War, we've had increases in recruitments and decreases in recruitment. You can look at the Iraq War. Often it's, it flows sort of with the economy. But what we're seeing different today is that than we've seen in the past is that military leaders are blaming the standard things of why people are ineligible to join. So that's obesity, physical and mental disqualifications for conditions that people may have. So that pool, knocks out almost 25% of the 75% of the American population ages 18 to, I think it's 24. So, they only have that maybe 25%, it varies year to year, to recruit from. And they have had no problem in recent years meeting their numbers, recruiting from that, 25% of the American population. They're having a significant problem now. And they're continuing, instead of addressing the actual problem, which is everything I write about in my book, they are still blaming the obesity and physical and mental conditions that are disqualifying from people. So they're not actually addressing the real people or the real reason why people don't want to serve today versus why they were still interested in serving a decade ago. And that is the woke policies that have been forced upon the military and this change in culture from one that is a meritocracy to one that is very focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is a massive distraction from the mission, and training and ensuring readiness is at the level that we maintain ourselves as the most elite fighting force in the world. So where the draft comes into that conversation is military leadership can continue to do what they're doing right now, which they haven't met their numbers for the most part in years. The Marine Corps is sort of holding strong, but the Marine Corps is also the one that has, for the most part, held on to their culture, where a lot of the other branches have done a drastic shift. But anyway, they are struggling with meeting those numbers. So instead of, addressing and fixing the problem, they are just lowering the numbers. So they're lowering the standard, and they're still not even meeting those lowered numbers. So it's just continuing to get worse. And sooner or later, they're going to have to find a way to get people to serve. And if for, God forbid, a national emergency or some sort of war breaks out, that is when they can, with Congress's approval, enact a draft to fill those numbers. So it's a very real possibility. Most people, this generation and up, don't remember or are not old enough to know sort of how the draft worked with Vietnam. And they have gotten very used to an all-volunteer force. And many people think that it's a guarantee. It is absolutely not a guarantee. And the current rate that we're going, it's not viable or sustainable.
Well, you mentioned in the book that morale is already low in the military because of a lot of these woke DEI things that are going on. What's going to happen when a bunch of people get drafted who really don't want to be there? What's that going to do to morale?
Well, I've always said, I have no doubt in my mind they can and would try to enact a draft. If the all volunteer force was no longer enough, and there was a war where draft numbers were needed, I personally think they will have an extremely hard time enforcing it in terms of, saying, okay, your birthday is one of the birthdays of the people who are getting drafted. I think that they are going to have a significantly, almost impossible time getting people to actually, essentially come forward and say, here I am ready to go serve in a war. I don't think we have a society that has an appetite for that anymore. So I think they can issue a draft essentially. I honestly don't know how effective they would be at enforcing it, which is an entirely bigger problem, because if a draft was needed and then people aren't actually coming forward to serve, it would be a very, very big issue. So the point is the problem needs to be solved before we get to that point. And we have a lot of leaders who are looking at everything but the actual problem. And you can't solve a problem if you don't acknowledge it exists.
That's very true. One of the things you mentioned in the book is that since the early 80s, they haven't even enforced the selective service registration requirement. I can remember back in 1981, turning 18, going to the post office and filling out my application form and actually feeling proud about it. I didn't really want a career in the military. I didn't want to have to serve, but I was proud of the fact that I had registered and that if Uncle Sam needed me, I would be there to protect America. So that's not really the way a lot of young people think now. And I think one of the things you pointed out in the book that's very relevant is that the belief that patriotism is important is really falling fast. People just don't think patriotism is important. People aren't patriotic anymore. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think it's just, I think generation after generation, people are used to the freedoms and liberties that we enjoy. And there are what I feel like today is a more quieter part of America that, loves America, is patriotic, and wants to preserve what we have. But our culture, just through the generations, has kind of shifted away from responsibility to preserve that. And we still see it. Like I said, less than 1% of the population at any given time is actively serving in the military. But people have stepped up to the plate enough to ensure that we maintain that all volunteer force. And so it is a societal, cultural shift as well, where, I would say our nation's in a stage of complacency right now with what it takes to preserve everything that we love about America. And it puts us sort of into the red zone with leadership and sort of being, our adversaries seeing windows of opportunity to take advantage of that weakness. And what has always been one of, our biggest deterrents from our adversaries around the world has been our military, that we have the strongest, most technologically advanced military, capable, elite fighting force in the world. That is slipping, and we have to acknowledge that the leadership issues that are going on at the Department of Defense right now at the top, especially most likely the political leadership and then the general officer corps, that I feel at this time is not being, for the most part, there are, a few good ones, but they're not doing what they need to do for the troops below them. And you saw that in so basically like any Afghanistan testimony in the last decade of the war, where every single general went up and testified on Capitol Hill and painted this rosy colored picture of the Afghan war, said the Afghan military was capable of defending itself against the Taliban and it would be a self-sustaining government, which was anything but the truth. Anyone who served in Afghanistan knew that it was not that simple, and that actually was not facts of what was going on the ground, especially how the Afghan military was fighting with American troops. Side by side, like it was still being led by U.S. military, even though it was fed to the American public and Congress that the Afghan military was pretty much doing everything. You had generals go up on Capitol Hill and say that under oath. And that is not the truth. To this day, there has been zero accountability for Afghanistan, not just for the withdrawal and the chaotic, horrific evacuation, but the war itself. And you saw generals pushing a forever war to just continue the war, kick the can down the road, no strategy, no end state, just give us more money so we can continue this war. So that type of leadership does not serve the military nor those who are serving, and it kills morale. It's confusing, and people see one thing in reality with their own eyes, and they see their leaders living not in reality and going and spewing those talking points and rhetoric publicly. And it does a significant disservice to the military as a whole.
When I read the line about the falling patriotism, one of the first things I thought of is, yeah, when you look at American campuses and you see kids shouting "Death to America, Death to Israel," that wouldn't suggest a whole lot of patriotism. And also, to the recruiting aspect of this, one of the things you mentioned in the book is that veterans are no longer encouraging their children and grandchildren to join the military. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's actually, this should frighten everyone that the Pentagon used to rely significantly on veterans, modern day veterans, as essentially recruiters. They knew they could rely on them as a demographic of service and promoting service. And that's what it had turned into. If you served, your children are more likely to serve. If your parents or your grandparents served, people close within their sphere of influence are much more likely to serve. And in the post 9/11 era, it's almost become a family business. And what we're seeing now is and this is very recent, in just the last couple of years, veterans are telling their children, especially, to find a different path and to not join the military. Of the dozens of service members that I interviewed for my book, I always ended my interviews the same way of, would you promote military service to your children or those close to you? And not a single one said yes. In fact, it was an immediate no. I had one person say no, but maybe the Air National Guard. So it's like the fact that these, veterans with considerable experience, but they're seeing the reality of the current day military and what the difference and what that means, and then saying, no. And until the military can fix itself and right itself and get itself back on track and turn itself back into a meritocracy, one that's focused on, equality, not equity, and giving everyone equal opportunity to try, but no guaranteed of an equal outcome, then they say no. And that's what leadership at the top has got to figure out if they truly want to fix the military.
One of the things you mentioned in the book is that a lot of people in the military are being encouraged to apply for food stamps. Now, if you're a young person thinking about going into the military and you hear the story about a lot of other people in the military having to be on food stamps because they make so little money, that's not a big recruitment tool either.
No, it's not. And it's actually for like the lower level soldiers, like the lower enlisted soldiers, and their paychecks, when they when they're married and have young families, and you look at inflation today, it's almost impossible to make those numbers work in terms of the salary that they're getting versus what it costs to feed a family in America today. So it's really sad. You had senior leaders encouraging their soldiers to just like sign up for food stamps as if that's like a solution. It may be a temporary solution and helpful in the moment, but when Americans are considering service as an option after high school and they see these stories, yes, it's a deterrent. And we live in an era where communication is instantaneous. We have social media where people are talking about this stuff online and on different social media platforms. And so people are seeing it in real time. It's not a narrative that the Pentagon has control over anymore when they have people who are currently serving, going and speaking about it themselves. And so that also is a difference, and not just with the food stamps example, but the living conditions of the barracks, of families, family housing on base, the mold that is not being addressed in the military right now, in the facilities, in the barracks, in family housing, and it's like they can't get help. The water quality, Like in Hawaii, there was like some fuel that had got into the water system, making people sick. And it's just, the issue is that it just doesn't get corrected in any sort of a timely manner. So in the meantime, people get sick. And it's like, oh, is that what you want? Is that what you're looking forward to when you get to serve the country? You get to live in a mold infested barracks room and not be able to afford groceries. But that's what's being put out now.
It almost sounds like a military version of let them eat cake. I mean, they're being very dismissive about it. It's like,
yes, that's a great way to put it.
Feel free to use it in your next book. Let's take a look at this. Let's talk about silencing dissent. One of the things you pointed out in the book is the military is very good at silencing dissent. And I actually have an example of this from a previous guest. There was a Professor Bruce Fleming at the Naval Academy who wrote a book called Saving Our Service Academies. He was talking about how the DEI stuff and the woke stuff was absolutely destroying our military service academies and putting out a poor quality graduate. And so now they pay him to do nothing. He no longer is allowed to teach class. He has an office. He does nothing. That's how they took care of Professor Fleming. But you've got a lot more examples of that, don't you?
Yeah, I would say, the biggest, most recent one, which is actually separate from DEI, is the COVID vaccine mandate. So that requirement from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin forced out, over 8,000 service members who, stood on principle and stood up against the mandate and had proof of why they did not want to take the shot. And the military literally did everything in their power to shut them down, and then eventually ended up kicking them out of the military. And, earlier in our conversation, we were talking about recruitment numbers and how they can't meet their numbers. 8,000 people is a lot of people. And these are people who have deployed and have priceless experience and cost, the military millions of dollars to train in whatever their specific job area was. But it was a huge, even worse was the message that it sent to the force, to those serving, that if you speak up, if you speak out against a wrongdoing, like when you're in the military, you were required to follow lawful orders. And the people who didn't pointed out why this mandate was unlawful. And instead of like using critical thinking and being like, all right, let me read this myself, let me figure this out, it was just blindly followed. And those who read it and were able to independently, figure out why this was wrong and then stand up to it, were quickly silenced, quickly shoved in a corner. They were no longer allowed to PCS, which is moved to a different duty station. They weren't allowed to go to schools. They had commands. They were fired from commands. And then ultimately they were kicked out of the military, lost benefits, lost their livelihoods, their salaries, etc. And then we saw in the NDAA, Congress reversed the ban and said that it was no longer lawful to enforce the COVID vaccine mandate. But that sent a very clear message to the troops that if you speak out, and not just on COVID, on absolutely any level, if you speak out against trans policy or double standards or DEI, or if you speak out against the evacuation of Afghanistan, you're going to get fired, or face some sort of punishment. And I think a lot of people saw that, and you hear a lot about the recruitment crisis, but what's looming sort of beneath the surface right now is what I often say is bigger than the recruitment crisis, which is the retention crisis. And there are people who are just miserable in the military right now and are seeing what's going on firsthand and are just putting their heads down and are just writing out their time until they can ETS, which is, get out of the military or retire, and then just be done with it. And, those are the people not recommending service to people who are interested in it, because they've seen what it's done. They've seen how the military changed. That's why I say that, the military that I served in doesn't exist anymore because it was different. We were focused on the mission. We were focused on training. We didn't have all of this woke stuff shoved down our throat. It was like things were clearer then. And that's sadly not what people who serve today. And it's sad. It's sad for people who have served to see what the military has turned into, because the military does and did great things for people. It teaches you leadership skills and lessons and ways to work with every single type of person you could ever imagine. Great Americans. But sadly, they've taken that away in terms of having the negative sort of outweigh the positive. So I do hope that this will get the attention that is required to right these wrongs. So people will see a military that they want to serve and join in the future.
I want to say very quickly about the COVID situation that you brought up, and it's extremely sad that a lot of the things that the military enlistment people, the military personnel were complaining about is that it was just an untested vaccine. I was in pharmaceuticals sales for 22 years. And the one conclusion from all of that I'm very, very sure about is you can't invent a vaccine and bring it to market in less than a year and be sure that it's safe. Now, slowly, step by step, the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, is coming out and admitting that a lot of the things we were concerned about are real. For instance, myocarditis.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very real thing. It speeds your pathway toward death. And now we know that the people that were worried about such things were correct.
Yeah, but it's like also we're a nation of laws, and the Department of Defense does not get to decide, as powerful as it is, when the laws apply to it and when it doesn't. And so the mandate that was written, the order that was put out by Secretary Austin was different than what every single officer below him implemented. And so it was, the order itself was not illegal, but the implementation was. And that's what these people were calling out, is that no, what Secretary Austin ordered, which was to take a fully FDA approved vaccine. The military didn't have fully FDA approved vaccines on hand. All they had was the emergency use vaccine. And that cannot be mandated. That can be taken voluntarily, but it cannot be mandated. The only person who can mandate an EUA vaccine is the president, the commander in chief. And obviously for political reasons, he chose not to do that. He kept it down at Secretary Austin's level. Secretary Austin does not have the authority to mandate to the service to take an emergency use authorized vaccine. So he only has the authority to mandate a fully approved FDA vaccine, which they did not have on hand. So even a lot of the people who did end up taking the vaccine felt coerced because they didn't have the right information. They didn't know they were taking an EUA vaccine. They thought they were taking the FDA approved vaccine. And so this was as shady as it gets. There was one of the Army Corps values is integrity. Tell me where there was some integrity with the way that they implemented this COVID vaccine mandate. They didn't. They blindly followed an order that was illegally implemented.
you had said the COVID vaccine wasn't really political, but in some ways it was. I mean, if you took a look at
it was political.
Oh,
No,
okay.
if I said that, no, it
okay.
absolutely was political. Yes.
Okay. And because if you take a look at it, the far left was very much in favor of it, although I'm not sure why. Back in the 60s, the far left was the group that was saying we don't want to be pushed around by the man. We don't want to be pushed around by Uncle Sam. And here we are in the 21st century, and they're doing whatever Uncle Sam tells them to do. They want a cradle to grave nanny state. So I thought that, I mean, it's like we've done this complete turnaround where the conservative right doesn't trust the government anymore, and the conservative left, wants to have a cradle to grave nanny state with the government being the nanny. So it's kind of interesting how things have turned on their head since I was born back in 1963. Amber, I want to thank you for being on the show today. Before we go, is there anything that you want to say about the book that we haven't covered so far?
So if people want to check it out themselves, they can head to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold. And if anybody's looking for a signed copy, you can head to my website, officialambersmith.com. And then you can always find me on social media at AmberSmithUSA.
And I take it you do speaking engagements as well?
I do, yes. Just reach out through my website if anyone is interested in getting in touch.
Very good. Amber, thank you for being here today. It's a fantastic book. It rings an alarm bell that everyone needs to listen to, and hopefully people will. Once again, thanks for being on.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Tea Party Power Hour with Mark Gillar.